This first technique is wet on wet, and what we're going to do for this technique is we're going to pre-wet a section, and then a lot of artists, when they're doing a wash, especially if it's for the background in a landscape or something, will pre-wet their section, and it'll even be wetter if you let it sit there a little bit, and it has a little bit of shine on there. Then we know that the water's really soaked into the paper. So that's what I'm going to do. But now that I've pre-wet it and I'm letting it soak in a little bit, I'm going to take and I'm just going to paint a wash on it. And you can either paint a flat wash like we did first, one that gets lighter in value, or a variegated wash that changes color. So I think I'll do just a flat wash this time. And what it is, you'll see how easy it is. When it's wet, it just really soaks into the paper and it kind of moves with the paper. You can kind of see how the paint just moves along with the paper. So this one, just by me brushing it, is going to get lighter and lighter as I go down the page. But there are a lot of artists who like to paint and do a lot of their techniques with wet paper, and that way it lets the paint move and flow a little bit, and you can see right here where it's still flowing, and that's a really beautiful technique that lots of watercolor artists like to use for their whole entire painting. Okay, the next one is wet on dry, and it says load a brush with pigment and draw calligraphic lines on a section. For this technique, I like to use a round brush, so we'll get it wet. Okay, we'll load with pigment, and calligraphic lines are lines that get thick and thin in the same stroke. So like you're doing really pretty handwriting, calligraphy, when you do calligraphy, you have thick and thin lines in one stroke. So if I come like this, and I'm going to hold my brush near the end of the handle so that I can really get those bristles touching there, and my brush will be straight up and down, and when I touch it, if I put more pressure down, I can get a thicker line, and when I let up, I get a thinner line. So let me show you that again. Thick and thin. I could also do like a letter. So let's say I would do, my first name starts with a J, so we'll do a J. So I can come here, thick and thin. So that's what you're going to do. Just show me some thick and thin lines in the same brush stroke. Depending on how much pressure I put down, I can really vary how thin my lines get. Okay, so that's calligraphic lines. The next section is going to be salt. So I'm going to paint a section with I want a pretty good amount of pigment, so I'm putting a little more into my brush. So we'll just paint it up. I want it to be nice and wet for this technique to work. And the trick is you have to use iodized salt. So I'm going to pour a little salt in my hand. Oh, I got too much. You don't need very much. Now I'm going to take it and sprinkle it on top of my paint. And hopefully it was wet enough, and you can see right here, hopefully, that it's starting to really soak into the paint, soaking right into the salt and making the salt darker. Okay, right in there. So once that dries, I can take and rub the salt off, and it'll create a cool texture with my paint. So on my salt technique, I went ahead here and I rubbed away and removed all the salt, and you can see that it's just left a little bit of a texture there. If you apply more salt, then you'll get more texture, or if you apply and use the more of the natural salt, the bigger grain salt, you get it removes more pigment. So that's something to experiment if you want that kind of a texture, but it is a good idea to remove the salt so you don't have a scratchy, salty painting. So the next one is rubbing alcohol. Same thing. I'm going to paint a section with pigment. Then I'm going to take the rubbing alcohol. I can pour a little of this rubbing alcohol into the cap because I don't need that much. And make sure that when you're done you put the cap back on because it will evaporate. In that same cupboard where the watercolor supplies are, there are some Q-tips. So I can dip my Q-tip in the paint and I can brush it on here. And you can see that it acts as a resist and pushes the paint away. I can also use my brush. You can see what it does there. So hopefully that is showing up pretty good for you. I'm going to give you a little bit more of a close-up on that one so that you can see what happens. Again, your paint has to be wet for this to be effective, and some pigments you'll get a much brighter effect than others. If you use the paintbrush, be sure that you clean it really well when you're done because it will ruin the brush. Alcohol really dries things out and we don't want it to ruin our brushes. Then you can just dump out the extra alcohol and put that away. So that can make a cool texture when you're done. I wasn't very happy with how the rubbing alcohol sample turned out that I was trying to show you, so I'm going to redo it. So I'm going to use thicker red paint. I'm going to work pretty fast with this, and I want it to be pretty thick and soupy, like wet. And then I'll take my rubbing alcohol, dip my brush into it, and you can see that that is a really neat effect. Just kind of creates a resist. Then with the Q-tip, it's pretty cool because you'll get these really cool just circles. So this one is much easier to see than the technique I did with red. Or with orange. Okay, so the next technique is technique number 6. It's scraping. Paint a section, and while the paint is still wet, use the pointed end of the brush to scrape off an area of paint. If the paint is very wet, the pigment will collect in the line and become dark, and if the paint is a little drier, the same action will leave a light line. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this section with quickly. And then I just turn my brush over and I use the pointed end to scrape. You can see if it sits there for a minute, sometimes where it's wet, it'll collect and make it darker. So you can see here in this corner, it's actually darkening that. Let me zoom in just a little bit so you can see that. And then here where it's a little drier, I can create some other lines and they'll stay a little lighter. So you kind of get two different techniques there. The next technique is dry brush. And for this technique, I believe that's number 7 on the handout, is squeeze the excess water out of the brush and then dip the brush into thick pigment. So you don't want your pigment on your tray to be very runny. You want to find one that's a little thicker that you can tell it's not running around, okay? And then you want your brush to be as dry as you can possibly get it, okay? And then let me make sure mine's clean. And it says, dip the brush into thick pigment and hold the brush perpendicular to the paper and quickly drag it across the surface of the paper. This technique works best on rough paper and with a stiff bristle brush. So my brush is not very stiff. It's a pretty flexible, thin brush. So I'll show you with that, and then I'll get a thick brush and show you how that works. This is a technique that works really great when if you're trying to do like grasses or brush, and you can tell that as I brushed my stroke here about 3 times, my water from the ferrule part or the reservoir part of my brush seeped down to the end of the tips, and so it became wet again, and so I had to kind of tap it off and dry it. So I'm going to get a stiff brush and show you that. Okay, so I've got a stiff bristle brush right here. Okay, so you can tell that's a very different kind of brush. I did wet the bristles down, and now I'm getting the excess water out of the brush, just gently squeezing, and then I'm going to dip it into my thick paint, and then you can see I'll get a whole different technique when I use a thick brush versus a thin brush. You can see how that would come in handy for you if you were doing something that needed a lot of texture. Okay, so that is dry brush. And these techniques, this dry brush technique, you can use, translates really well to other types, mediums of paint as well, like acrylic or tempera paint.